from a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, tips on how to lighten the mood when the fun family get-together suddenly becomes a dialysis machine reveal party. And now, the podcast host who has no problem with such things because he's a comedian and his kidneys are hopefully just fine, Pete Dominic!
That's right, so far, so good, Pete Co. Thank you very much. Good to have you back, and good to be here with all of you. I've got the great Tim Wise joining me today to talk about the Supreme Court's decision ruling out affirmative action for college admissions. A great conversation with Tim, as always. Before that, I've got a little news recap, a few things I want to play for you here at the very beginning of July. Happy July, everybody. We are here, we made it, and it is summer, New Year's Eve, because the 4th of July is coming up. How do you feel about the 4th of July in terms of the celebrate the America's independence? I'll be talking with Kenneth C. Davis on tomorrow's show, very special 4th of July history show. We're not only going to be talking about the War of Independence, but we're going to be talking about Gettysburg, which occurred at this time in July. The battle took place the 1st to the 3rd of 1863. And I'll be talking with him. That'll be great tomorrow. Also, Dr. Michael Mann and Dr. Peter Hotez are scheduled to join me together this week. I've got Chrissy Greer and so much more coming your way this week. Lots of good stuff coming. Thank you to all of you who have edited your pledges up. So many people are paying just a few bucks more, and I really appreciate it, recognizing the hard work that I'm doing here. I got the sweetest message from longtime listener Martha, who texted and said, Pete, you've built a brand and a community around a culture of compassion and self-improvement and honesty. I honestly don't think you could do much better than that. Wow, Martha, that was just the nicest text. I told her that, but I do feel like that's what we have done together here, a community around a culture of compassion and self-improvement and honesty and vulnerability and humor, folks. And speaking of the humor part of it, all this week I'm going to be complaining, mostly tongue-in-cheek, but also kind of seriously, about fireworks. I have a nuanced view on it, meaning fireworks just begun. I just hate them when people are launching them from their houses. It's one thing when your town puts them up at a set time, but last night it seemed like my neighbors were at war with each other, and my house was the demilitarized zone. They litter the ground, they fall in the pool, they pollute the air, they scare everything from your dog to your cat to every creature in the woods. I just find it really dumb. Plus, obviously, it's pretty dangerous. So I reached out to people. I'd love to hear from you. If you've got a take, send me a minute-long message like my friend Zach Lewis did in Missouri. I thought this was real funny.
Hey, Pete. Zach Lewis here. It's evening of Sunday, July 2nd. I'm sitting here watching the U.S. men's national team versus Trinidad and Tobago in the Gold Cup soccer, and thinking about your aversion to all things celebratory for our major holidays. You know, you are anti-inflatables, you are anti-fireworks, and I just want to tell you that you need to loosen up just a little bit. I mean, fireworks are as American as all the other foreign-made celebratory trinkets are, you know? And just take it in. And I've been buying and shooting fireworks for over 40 years in this country, and I think it's time that you embrace it and join in and be part of the celebration as opposed to the party pooper that you are when it comes to fireworks. You don't have to go all out. You don't have to start the neighborhood on fire. Just go to your local stand and buy some bottle rockets and some little things that, like the tanks. Buy some tanks and some smoke bombs. And if you do it in your own area, you only clean up your stuff, and then nobody's mad at you. The cops don't get called, and you have a great time. So my advice this 4th of July for you, Pete, is just to spend some time blowing some shit up. Have a great day.
Thank you, Zach, and I look forward to hearing from more of you all this week. Make a voice memo in support or anti-fireworks, however you want. We can have fun ranting about this. I talk about the most important problems that affect you and your family, your community, your country, your planet here on the podcast. It's sometimes fun to talk about things that might annoy us, bother us, or we actually wish there were laws around, knowing that we're not going to please everybody. And this week, the conversation topic is fireworks. So email me your thoughts in a voice memo or send it however you want. standupwithpete@gmail.com. And of course, you can react to and be critical of Zach's message. He can definitely take it. All right. Let me get to a few audio clips from the weekend. First of all, speaking of comedy, I don't know. Actually, I don't know what category to put this in. It was funny to me, but it's also very pathetic. So Lindsey Graham is a senator from South Carolina, and there he was over the weekend at a big rally with former President Donald Trump, of course, who is running again. And Trump himself was critical, lightly made fun of Lindsey Graham because he mentioned his name and he got booed. I'm not going to play that part. I'm going to play the part where they introduce Lindsey Graham in his home state where he's a senator to Trump rally, and he gets booed in a way I don't think I have heard since I walked out on the stage at Universal Amphitheater in front of 6,000 people who were expecting Artie Lang. But to be fair, I wasn't in my home state and nobody knew who I was. This is Lindsey Graham in the state where he's one of two senators.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome United States Senator Lindsey Graham.
I mean, listen to them. It's amazing. And then here he comes. Now he's on stage, and here he's starting to talk.
Welcome to Pickens. Thank y'all for coming.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
For what?
Thank y'all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Unbelievable.
Thanks a bunch. Well, you want to find something in common?
No. Get off the stage. Traitor.
All right. Thank y'all. Thank you all very much. Welcome to Pickens County. A little bit about this county. Just calm down for a second. I think you'll like this. Pickens County.
And then it goes on from there. I can't bear to take anymore or torture you with it anymore, but that was quite satisfying to me. I mean, does anybody like him? Who are his friends? Who likes Lindsey Graham in the public in South Carolina? How come he keeps getting reelected there? I guess that's a question for another day. All right. Well, what else do I have for you? Oh, how about this one? I thought this was great. Quite a bit of talk in reaction to the Supreme Court invalidating President Biden's student debt forgiveness plan over the weekend on social media, on TV, and pretty much everywhere. But the best reaction I thought I heard was from the Secretary of Education. His name is Miguel Cardona. And on Friday, he blasted Republicans and singled them out, which I think is really effective for their hypocrisy on this issue. Here he is from the White House briefing room on Friday.
Today, the court substituted itself for Congress. It's outrageous to me that Republicans in Congress and state offices fought so hard against a program that would have helped millions of their own constituents. They had no problem handing trillion-dollar tax cuts to big corporations and the super wealthy. And many had no problems accepting millions of dollars in forgiven pandemic loans. Like Senator Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma had more than $1.4 million in pandemic loans forgiven. He represents 489,000 eligible borrowers that were turned down today. Representative Brett Guthrie from Kentucky had more than $4.4 million forgiven. He represents more than 90,000 eligible borrowers who were turned down today. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia had more than $180,000 forgiven. She represents more than 91,800 eligible borrowers who were turned down today.
All right, I thought that was pretty effective. I would love to see more of that kind of naming names with the hypocrisy of these types of things. Just terrible. But here is some hope. Congressman Ro Khanna praising President Biden's continued efforts to cancel federal student loan debt even after the Supreme Court struck down his initial plan. Here is the congressman on ABC's This Week yesterday.
We've heard from the White House that they are going to now pursue an alternative means of trying to provide some help for people saddled with student debt, working through the Higher Education Act. The president said that's going to take time. Do you think the White House is doing enough?
John, I am pleased that the White House is invoking the Higher Education Act. As you know, Justice Roberts explicitly said in the opinion that the opinion has no bearing on the Higher Education Act. I do hope that the White House will make sure that the interest doesn't accrue starting in September. I know the president has said he isn't going to refer students to the credit agency. I also believe under the Higher Education Act, he can stop the interest accrual.
All right, we'll talk more about the student loan debt forgiveness plan and what could be done in coming days and weeks right here on Stand Up. If you know somebody that we should be talking to about it, let me know. And all right, let's see. What's this? Pete Buttigieg torching Ron DeSantis campaign over their anti-LGBT ad. He was on CNN State of the Union with Dana Bash, and this ad bizarrely showed former President Donald Trump's ties to the LGBT community, then showed various images of DeSantis attempting to project strength, which were juxtaposed with random images of shirtless bodybuilders. And that wasn't lost on the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, in this nuanced and thoughtful answer on CNN.
You know, I'm going to choose my words carefully, partly because I'm appearing as secretary, so I can't talk about campaigns. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to leave aside the strangeness of trying to prove your manhood by putting up a video that splices images of you in between oiled up shirtless bodybuilders, and just get to the bigger issue that is on my mind whenever I see this stuff in the policy space, which is, again, who are you trying to help? Who are you trying to make better off? And what public policy problems do you get up in the morning thinking about how to solve? You know, we're focused as an administration on how to get things done to make people better off. I spent my week traveling around the country to places that are benefiting from infrastructure funding. We were in Appalachia, in an eastern Kentucky community that's been wiped out by floods repeatedly, and we're bringing them highway funding that's going to help them not only improve the road, but also improve the dam and protect them from floods in the future. A few weeks ago, we were in North Dakota, where there's a railroad crossing that was a community headache for decades. And thanks to President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure funds, we finally have the resources to do something about it. And we're going to make that better and have it not be a problem holding back first responders. These are the kinds of problems that most of us got into government, politics, and public service in order to work on. And I just don't understand the mentality of somebody who gets up in the morning thinking that he's going to prove his worth by competing over who can make life hardest for a hard-hit community that is already so vulnerable in America.
All right, I thought that was a great reaction from the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, on CNN yesterday. And the rest of the program is going to be a conversation dedicated to the issue of affirmative action and the Supreme Court's decision on Friday. I've got a great conversation coming up with Tim Wise, but there was so much great commentary out there about this, and there has been for years on this debate. But I thought this was interesting. This is a huge misconception that affirmative action is meant that unqualified people would be admitted into college solely because of their race. It's never been true, and it's an ignorant interpretation, says Ben Crump, attorney Ben Crump. And here is Joy Reid kind of setting the record straight while talking to Chris Hayes on MSNBC. I thought this was pretty good. Joy, of course, a Harvard graduate.
Well, let me just be clear. I got into Harvard only because of affirmative action. I went to a school no one had ever heard of in Denver, Colorado, in a small suburb. I didn't go to Exeter or Andover. Yeah, I didn't have college test prep. I just happened to be really nerdy and smart and have really good grades and good SAT scores. Right. But someone came to Denver, Colorado to look for me. A Harvard recruiter flew to Denver, and I met up with her at the Village Inn restaurant and did a pre-interview to get to pull me into Harvard. I was pulled in, and the schools like Harvard and Yale that I got into affirmatively. Yes. And it was literally not saying we're going to take an unqualified person and put them in Harvard. Yes. We're going to take a very qualified person who we would never know existed and put them in Harvard. That's how I got there. That's how Ketanji got there. That's how Justice Jackson, I should say. Justice Jackson got there. It's how Clarence Thomas got there. Right. But the minute I arrived from my majority black little town, Montbello in Denver, to Harvard, the first week or two that I was in class, my presence was questioned by white people. I was in this big conference class where some white students stood up and said, those students, the black students, they're only here because of affirmative action. It became a huge argument that we all ended up having. This was freshman year. I had never had my academic credentials questioned. I had never had anyone question whether I was intelligent until I got to Harvard. And it was a defining point of my experience there. It's why I really was one of the many reasons I was miserable there my freshman year. Yeah. You feel completely out of place, and people keep telling you shouldn't be here. And yet, some of the people I went to school with were far less smart than me or the other black folk there. They got in because their daddy and their granddaddy. I went to school with somebody whose name was on one of the buildings. You're going to school with people whose names are on the buildings, who are third and fourth generation legacies, whose parents pumped money into Harvard to get them in. But that affirmative action is okay with this majority. They said that the people who benefited from slavery, their descendants, who are so far ahead of black folk in terms of opportunity, that we'll never catch up to them. I don't care how many Oprahs we get. Those people's affirmative action is A-okay, because those people can pay for fancy trips for them. Yeah. But you people who want to get in just because of your brains, but you're not from a legacy, too bad. You can't come in.
Mwah! Chef's kiss for just an amazing, nuanced, personal, brilliant commentary from the always great Joyanne Reid over on MSNBC. I thought my friend Qasim Rashid has been really good on this as well. Here he is.
Here's the thing that MAGAs don't seem to understand about affirmative action. It was never about admitting unqualified black kids. It was always about ensuring that qualified black kids could actually get a fair shake at admission. MAGAs want us to forget at the levels of systemic racism in universities. I mean, my God, do they realize that HBCUs exist specifically because after raping, enslaving, murdering, lynching, and torturing black people for 400 years, they wouldn't even allow black children to read a book. So black people had to build their own schools. And for those claiming that systemic racism is over, when? When did those systems of white supremacy stop? Because right now, black and brown schools get $23 billion less in funding than white schools, despite serving the same number of students. Because even now, 43% of white students at Harvard are there only because of legacy, and 3/4 of them would not have qualified on merit, meaning they took a seat from a more qualified black, Asian, or white student. And spare me the MAGAs who say, we had to repeal affirmative action because it's discriminatory to Asians. No, first of all, Asians also benefited from affirmative action. And moreover, is this the same GOP that near unanimously voted to block a resolution condemning anti-Asian discrimination? The actual unqualified admission you should be upset about are people like Justice Kavanaugh getting into Yale on legacy. The bottom line is this: don't blame black people for your own mediocrity.
Well, who am I supposed to blame then? I mean, I've got to blame somebody for my mediocrity. It can't be people of color. Then I'm left with myself? Huh. Which, by the way, brings me to my final point here on today's opening segment, the A block, if you will. You've heard me mention self-pity here on the program last week. It resonated with quite a few people. I mentioned, I think maybe at the end of the show. I would love for you to, at the end of this conversation here, my conversation with Tim Wise, stay and listen to this quote from Stephen Fry. I'm probably going to play it a few more times. It's about self-pity. It's this idea that I've discovered. Many of you probably already have an understanding of this or don't deal with it, but it's an issue I discovered I was dealing with as a result of what could be maybe a pretty good life, that when things go wrong or they aren't as I hope they would be, that I'm disappointed about a rejection or a failure, that I tend to wallow in self-pity. Recently realized, and embarrassingly it took me till I'm almost 50 years old, that it's a real bad, corrosive idea and feeling. So comedian, actor Stephen Fry I grabbed this great quote from him, and I'll play it after my conversation with Tim Wise. But let's get to that right now. And as a reminder, I can't do the show without your paid subscription, and I'm going to be pumping out a whole lot of conversations with your favorite experts and new experts here on the program throughout the month of July. So please consider a subscription if you haven't already. Just head on over to patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And while I'm plugging things real quick, whatamimaking.substack.com is the Substack that my friend Matty Carlson makes. He's taking a big risk going out on the road and starting this new podcast. I got a lot of respect for that. And he's coming up on dates in Rome, New York. That's tonight, Monday. Then he's headed to East Hampton, where he'll be John Carroll's place, July 5th. Kingston, New York, Therese Place here in Kingston. He's scheduled to be in Harrisburg on July 7th. D.C., Charlotte, Asheville, Hawthorne, Florida, Knoxville, Nashville, Cynthia, Kentucky, however that's pronounced, Indianapolis at the end, July 15th, mid-July. So there's Matt dates. Go support him. A lot of amazing people doing amazing things in our listening community, and if you're one of them and want me to plug it, I'd be happy to. I love trying to help out and shout out people that are doing good stuff. So just email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, now it's time to get to Tim Wise, who is simply one of our favorite guests here. Very few people are as eloquent, articulate, passionate, righteous, and absolutely brilliant as Tim Wise, who actually wrote a book on affirmative action, Racial Preference in Black and White, published a few years back. He's written several books, I should say, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, Dear White America, Colorblind, and most recently a collection of his excellent essays at Dispatches from the Race War. You gotta have that one in your library. He's still active on social media. You can find out more links to Tim's work and career. You can hire Tim as well. Support him on Patreon. Speakoutnow.org is the website. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Tim Wise on affirmative action.
Now, how cool was it when I saw somebody tweet, we were so happy to have Tim Wise here giving our keynote. You've probably given several. I'm not sure where I feel like you might have been in Buffalo.
I was just in Buffalo. Absolutely.
They love you in Buffalo. That sounds great. What was that about?
Well, it was an NAACP event, right. And it was, it's the 1 year anniversary just passed of the supermarket shooting, the white racist terrorist massacre at the market there in Buffalo that killed 10 and injured 3 others. And so it was not a commemorative event per se, but it was falling in that same, week to 2 week time frame that it had been a year ago. And there was a lot of commemoration or memory involved in the event, but it was an NAACP of Buffalo event. Lots of great folks were there. The mayor was there. The congressman from that area was there. Got a chance to meet with him. A lot of amazing activists, local grassroots folks, people from the Urban League, lots of different organizations, all coming together to really, show their resilience in the face of this horrible, horrible trauma that the community experienced a year ago. With that shooting. And it was inspiring to see that level of resilience, because what it said, and I said this in my remarks, the shooter in that case, the terrorist in that case, whose name I'm not going to mention, and all of these guys, Charleston, Pittsburgh, wherever, they always assume that the communities they attempt to intimidate, whether it's the Black community in Buffalo or in Charleston, or whether it's the Jewish community in Pittsburgh or wherever it is, they always assume that those communities are a hell of a lot weaker than they are, and that the terrorists, are stronger than they are. They overestimate their own power, and they vastly underestimate the power of the marginalized. And so if you're going to take on Black Buffalo and you're going to try to cow them and bring them to their knees, they're going to let you know Black folks have been fighting back against terrorism, both individual and systemic, for hundreds of years. And some snot-nosed kid on 4chan or Reddit with a semi-automatic weapon might think that he can destroy that power, but those folks are a hell of a lot stronger than some people give them credit for.
Yeah, well said. And a year later, you're seeing all kinds of really great journalism, I think, documenting where that community is. I'm glad to see, I think, like NPR was doing something, but you saw it firsthand, and that's awesome. I'm glad they got to have you there, and I'm glad you got that opportunity. I wanted to talk with you, of course, about the affirmative action decision that came down yesterday, but you have a lot to say about all of these decisions. So maybe why don't we just start with your reaction to the college loan forgiveness or the LGBT rights, or the 303 Creative is the fake company that apparently never was even asked to make a website for gay people that weren't even gay. It's really convoluted. But what are your thoughts on this court this June?
Well, I think it's fascinating that they held these three to the very end. Well, it's not surprising because they understand the sort of radical nature of what they've just done. The fact that they, simply announced that the president doesn't have the authority, even under existing statute as it is written, which seems to suggest, and previous courts said he did, the authority to engage in this loan cancellation is an act of judicial activism. This is exactly the kind of thing that conservatives on the court say they're against, that they want to defer to elected officials, right? But in this particular case, they're saying, no, we're gonna put this debt back on you, and we're going to do so without regard for the consequences. Keep in mind, these loan payments are going to start coming due here in a few months. And when that happens, we're going to see individuals who had been saving money, who'd been, putting money away perhaps for their first home or whatever, are going to now have to go back into debt, probably have calamitous economic ramifications, but the court doesn't care. As far as the website design case, I think this is the first instance. I could be wrong, but I think it's the first instance where the Supreme Court has made a decision on behalf of a plaintiff who lied about the entire case and all the facts of the case. This individual shouldn't have had standing to sue in the first place because no one had asked her to make a website for any wedding. She'd never done a wedding website ever, let alone for a same-sex couple. No one asked her. And in fact, what we now know, because the New Republic reported on this just yesterday, as you and I are talking, that after they filed the case, the very next day, there's supposedly a submission to her contact page on her website by a guy who's asking for a website for his marriage to another man. It turns out this guy is already married to a woman, has kids, never submitted any such form. So the entire case was fabricated by a right-wing legal group, right, for the sake of essentially saying we want to carve out in the law for individuals who do not want to in any way, shape, or form provide any service basically to gay folk. And in a sense, what they've done by carving that out, I want people to understand the radical nature of the case. It's not just that it was, predicated on a lie, but what the court has said, this wasn't a religious liberty case. A lot of people think that's what this was, that she was arguing her religious liberty is infringed by having to make a website potentially theoretically for a gay couple when she doesn't support gay marriage. It wasn't brought under those terms. It's a First Amendment case. What they were arguing is that no one should be compelled, just like you can't be prohibited from speaking, you shouldn't be compelled to speak in a way that you don't agree with, which makes sense on one level. I understand that's longstanding legal precedent. The problem here is that there is no guardrail for that. Once you say that a person can deny a service based on their, disbelief of, let's say, same-sex marriage, now, there's nothing to prevent anyone whose job or whose service is in any way artistic. It could be a website. It could be business cards. It could be a cake. It could be a chef in a restaurant who thinks that his or her cooking is a form of artistic expression. It could be any kind of service or good. If there's any artistic element, now the court has basically said that you cannot be compelled to provide that service to anyone if you don't want to, meaning not just same-sex couples. Right. It's not specific to that. It could be interracial couples. It could be interfaith couples. It could be black people as black people, theoretically. It could be virtually anything. So they've essentially said we are going to undermine one of the key elements of civil rights law going back over half a century for the sake of a woman who wasn't even injured. That's how radical this court has become. And I think it just speaks to the issue of the unaccountability of this court and the way that it has been stacked on behalf of a reactionary politic, the vast majority of which the American public rejects.
Let's talk about, that's great analysis and cite on that case in that situation. We can go much further, but let's talk about college loan forgiveness and affirmative action, because smarter people than I, and I'm sure you've already made this connection, are that there's a real intersection or overlap between who that affects. And it's not powerful people. It's not wealthy people. It doesn't only affect, obviously, black folks, but there's a huge overlap, especially with the college loan forgiveness, with people who don't have a lot of money, to say it as crudely and as simply as possible. And I think that matters, that how many people get hurt literally injured by these decisions. And of course, you wrote the book, literally, on affirmative action. You've debated it. Very few people know more than you. And if you can, within your answer, I think I get confused and other people get confused with affirmative action laws and regulations around employment and around admissions, because it's different.
They are different, and the existing sort of requirements have up to now been different. But this decision is going to affect more than just admissions. I mean, there is no doubt that there will be employers, there will be individuals working in state governmental agencies who are going to try to use this decision to justify ending affirmative action in those arenas as well. So it's not like it's going to be limited. Again, very few guardrails for these decisions. Once you open that Pandora's box, you really can't close it back again. And so essentially what the court has announced, without the evidence to support it, is that we have attained that moment of racial equality where we no longer have to make deliberate efforts to ensure racial equality. And John Roberts' statement, it was interesting. It wasn't in the decision, but it was in the oral argument when the case was being argued. And one of the lawyers for Harvard, which was one of the two schools being sued in this case, made the point that yes, race may be involved in the decision. It may be the key for certain people who get in, just like being an oboe player, right, might be the key for somebody getting in. Person could have chosen any example, a dancer, an athlete, whatever. And John Roberts' response lets you know how little this court cares about sociological context. He said, yes, but we didn't have a civil war to stop the fighting or with oboe players. We didn't have a civil war over oboe players. We had a civil war to end racial discrimination. That's not true. We had a civil war to end enslavement of black people and white supremacy. It wasn't generic racial discrimination. It was systematized oppression of a particular group by another group, because that was the only kind that existed. So the idea that John Roberts is suggesting that affirmative action at Harvard and UNC and 150 other schools where it's practiced, because it's really only the 150 to 175 most selective schools that even do affirmative action to any real extent. The idea that 175 schools' affirmative action plans are equal, in effect, to the Dred Scott decision, which said black people had no rights that white men were bound to respect, or that it's equal to enslavement or it's equal to Jim Crow, is fascinating. Not only for its ignorance, but for what it reveals about the way this court understands sociological truth and power. They essentially are saying that there is no difference between a welcome mat, which is what affirmative action is, and a no trespassing sign, which is what segregation was, what Jim Crow was, what the whole history of this country has been. It's really quite extraordinary.
I talked about, the quick takes on this decision with my favorite constitutional law professor, Eric Siegel. So we talked about the legal more, the precedent, Supreme Court's decision. You've touched on that. But obviously, I want to, talk more with you about the policy and what it actually means for people's lives. And it would seem, and I've seen many interpretations of this, and I feel like I've seen press releases from colleges from Harvard to Cal Berkeley to Indiana University that put out like, this does not say that we can't still do what we do to get a diverse group of people. Like, it seems like there's a loophole where colleges won't necessarily have to change their admissions, their recruiting standards to do what they've always done to try to keep a diverse group of students coming in. What is your analysis of what they're calling, how they're interpreting that?
I hope that they're serious about that. The problem, it depends. Like, certain schools won't have to change very much. And the reason, ironically, is because most schools weren't doing that much. I mean, the irony of this decision is that the right seems to think that, like, black folks just all get into college because of affirmative action. And that if their little Susie or Johnny didn't get in, it's because the black person took their slot, which is, of course, not statistically accurate. It's completely absurd. But they seem to think that that's the case.
To be fair, that did happen to me. And I know it for a fact because a friend of mine in college who's black told me, I took your slot. Like, every day he told me that. He was referring to actual physical space, chairs at the table, and our room that we shared and so on. That's how I know. But other people think it's just conjecture.
Right. I think you're right. And in this particular case, I think what the court, or what people misunderstand, is that it's sort of like back in 2003 when the University of Michigan undergrad, the court ruled against the undergrad and threw out their affirmative action plan. Right. And the only reason it survived after 2003 at all was because the University of Michigan Law School case, they had a slightly different, less direct way of doing it. So the court said, you can do it like the law school, you can't do it like the undergrad. But the irony was the undergrad had already stopped doing it that way.
Right.
They had already changed their policy, and most schools don't do. And in fact, Harvard, look at the Harvard case. There isn't any evidence introduced in this case that Harvard specifically for any given student let them in because they were Black or Latino, or for any given Asian or white student that they were excluded because they were white or Asian. The argument rested on two things, one of which had nothing to do with affirmative action at all. They argued that Asian students were being discriminated against based on like a personality score that had something to do with likability or affect. And it was like very subjective. And you know what? They're probably right. That probably was used in a way that was harmful to Asian students. The evidence seems to suggest it, but that's not part of affirmative action. That's not an affirmative action policy. That's a policy that could have been eradicated. They could have said, you can't do that. That's too subjective and given to bias, and you can't do that, without getting rid of the rest. So that's a non-issue, or should have been. The second thing they pointed to were essentially raw data on the admissions odds for Black students versus Asian students, for instance. And they said if you were an Asian student in the top 25% of applicants, your odds of getting in were no better than a Black student in the fourth quartile, right? The bottom quartile. And that's supposedly evidence of massive preferential treatment. But you can't make that argument for any given student. And in fact, the plaintiffs didn't argue that the Black students were unqualified. They never argued that. They just said that if this group is more qualified in terms of SAT scores and this group is quote unquote less, they shouldn't have equal admissions odds. But that's wrong, because the truth is the Asian subgroups have disproportionately high SAT scores. It's not because they're superior. It's not because they're culturally better, but it's because on average, applicants to Ivy League schools who are Asian come from families with about 2 times the annual income and considerably more assets. These are not poor Asian students typically. These are not Southeast Asian students disproportionately who have high poverty rates. These are more affluent Asian students, so they do score higher. And if there's a lot of them, then the odds for any one of them is going to be sort of low, right? If you've got a huge group of people who are trying to get in somewhere, and then down here among the Black students who could potentially qualify, that's a smaller group because they have faced various obstacles, they're going to have better odds. If you have a small group, any given person in a small group is going to have better odds than a person in a huge group. It's one of the reasons that when you look at Ivy League and other elite schools, applicants from Utah have 45 times the odds of getting in compared to applicants from California, even when their qualifications are the same. It's not because of a Mormon preference, right? It's because the applicants from Utah that are qualified to go there in the first place, it's a smaller group even trying. So if I'm an admissions officer and I see a kid from Provo who looks pretty good, even if they don't look quite as good as the kid that went to Dalton in New York City, or they don't look quite as good as the kid that went to Harvard Westlake in LA, maybe their score is not quite as high. But you know what? Like, hey, that's cool. That's somebody from Utah. That's a different experience and they are qualified. Let's let them in. Nobody complains about that. But if it's Black students, we assume there's something untoward going on. So just as with the website case, the court is constructing facts out of thin air to justify something that they've been wanting to do for 20 plus years.
Well, yeah, based on that, how much have you read of the conclusions that they made from, Clarence Thomas and the reaction to him being a part of this decision to the dissents from, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ketanji Brown Jackson? How much of, what are you reading into why they say they made the decision and why the others are so upset about it?
Well, I haven't read all the decisions in detail. I've just skimmed them. I think that the dissents are powerful, and they are certainly rooted in a sociologically accurate analysis of where we sit as a country. Now, some of the folks in the majority opinion here may honestly believe that we have attained this level of ostensible colorblindness where this is no longer needed. Others may not believe that. John Roberts does acknowledge in his opinion, which I think is what these schools are hanging their hat on that you referenced earlier. The idea that, hey, there's nothing, for instance, that would keep an applicant from utilizing in their essay or in a personal interview or a personal statement talking about race and how it's affected them personally, right? So in other words, I can definitely talk about my racial experience because that's may be really important to me individually. So in a sense, if schools are sincere about wanting to maintain diversity and equity, and not just maintain, but do a lot better than they've been doing. Because let's be honest, these schools they're not just kicking ass on admitting Black and brown students. They're not. Very few of them are. But in order to maintain and go beyond that, they're going to need to come up with ways to view all students holistically, not just Black students and Latino students, right? Working class students of all races, students who've had adverse childhood experiences that won't even necessarily all be poor. I mean, there are plenty of folks that are middle class and above who've had traumatic experience. And you know what? We need all of our human experiences to be considered relevant to who we are by the time we're 18, let's say, if we're a traditional college age applicant and applying to school. And I'm sure some people would say, why are we looking at that at all? Why don't we just look at the SAT and the grades? Well, because nobody gets a test score or grades in a vacuum. Right. We don't go to school for 12 years and have the same experiences and the same curriculum such that at the end of it, we can go, oh, here's 50 million kids who took the test this year. They all took the same test under the same conditions. Therefore, we can just rank them. That's not
I had to take a shit my entire SAT. Nobody accounts for that.
Right. Well, I had been drunk the night before mine.
Nobody accounted for that either.
Right.
And you're smart.
Well, but I didn't test well. And so the point being, if you want to have, no one is saying we shouldn't look at academic preparation, because no one, including these schools, wants to set kids up for failure. No one wants somebody to go to Yale that can't succeed at Yale. Right. But what we know from the research is that the ability to succeed, even at a highly selective school, is not contingent on getting an incredibly high SAT score. GPA in high school is far more important to how you're going to do in college. So if you had a good GPA in school, or you had a high class rank, which means that you demonstrated perseverance, stick-to-itiveness, you studied, you tried hard, that is far more relevant than a test you took one time for 3 hours or maybe 2 or 3 times. And it's especially more relevant for Black students and Latino students who tend to get lower test scores even when they had good grades. So why are we adding the SAT? Why are we adding the ACT? Well, because it correlates very well with zip code. Right. So if I'm somebody that lives in an affluent zip code, I probably am going to do far better on that test. That's why it doesn't change. It's functional for people in positions of power and authority. So what schools are going to have to figure out is, how do we change the system? Not lower standards. It's not about lowering them. It's not about only looking at identity as if that was the end all be all. It's about saying we need to come up with a different way to evaluate merit, a more comprehensive way, and they're going to have to spend some money to do that. The thing that makes me angriest about this decision isn't even the court. I expected this 20 years ago from this court. This has just been a slow burn. We've been waiting for this literally for 20 years. Right. But what I'm angry about is that the schools themselves didn't do a better job coming up with real ways to get diversity and equity. They tried to do it on the cheap. They tried to do it by rigging the system or by having this, whatever, the personality index, and that way it's all, something they can just sort of gamify. They're doing that for them. Harvard wasn't doing that for Black people. Harvard was doing that for Harvard, right? Stanford's not doing that for Black people. They're doing it for Stanford. UNC's not doing it for Black people. They just got rid of that damn Silent Sam racist statue, like 2 years ago? They ain't doing things for Black people. They're doing that for UNC. They're doing it for PR. They're doing it for U.S. News and World Report. So if schools are serious, they better be ready to put up some real money, money to send out the recruiters, money to train the admissions team, money to actually bring in people for interviews, including people that can't afford maybe to come in for interviews, or make sure they get 2 or 3 Zoom calls at least. They're going to have to be prepared to put up money for financial aid, because one of the problems right now is, even when they do affirmative action, it's usually going to full pay students, people whose families have more money and are able to pay. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't apply to them, because even affluent Black folks have faced racism. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if you really want to do diversity and equity and inclusion, the stuff you claim you want to do, you better be prepared to put out money, not just do stuff like what the University of Michigan was doing 25 years ago with a point system where you could just plug in a formula. Oh, and then this is how we get that. You got to be more creative, and you got to be more committed to doing the really hard work. And I think some schools will do a good job, and I think, frankly, a lot of other schools won't. But the problem is, if we're going to allow evidence of differential admissions odds, which is what they did in this case, to be evidence of discrimination, then this will never end, because that different admissions odds, that's going to always exist if they let any black people in. Because as a group at elite schools, black applicants are going to be a smaller group of people who are going to have the high enough SAT scores. And again, that's not because there's something wrong with black people. It's because there's something wrong with America and the K-12 educational system. And there's something that creates that inequality. But as long as that's true, if you've got a school where there's, let's say, 100 really highly qualified black people applying, and you've got 2,000 really highly qualified white people applying, and 1,500 really highly qualified Asian people applying, by definition, the group that's smaller is going to have better odds for any individual in that group. If you let 10 of the 50 in, right? What does that mean? It means you've got an admissions acceptance rate of 20%, and the other groups, just based on how many slots there are, might have an admissions odds of 10%. Is that going to be proof of unfairness? According to the court, it will be, right? So this is basically making it impossible for elite schools to bring in any significant number of black students, because if you bring in any significant number, even if they're qualified, they're going to have higher admissions odds rates, better admissions odds than Asian students and white students. And it's not because they're not qualified. It's because they're coming from a smaller cohort, like the Utah, California example.
Right. Wow. Yeah, there's a lot there. But let me ask you to react to one of many people, right-wing folks, in this case, the governor of Arkansas, who tweeted, as many are, talking about Dr. King's speech, the only line they can remember. She wrote, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, people should not be judged on the content of their character, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, people should be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. The Supreme Court affirmed that fundamental truth in today's decision. Of course, talking about the affirmative action decision. But finally, she writes, the greatness of America is that it doesn't matter where you start. You get to decide where you finish. I did not know you get to decide where you finish. I love that idea.
Well, you don't get the choice to be born to the former governor of Arkansas, but you do get to be the governor yourself. And I'm sure she got there all on her own devices. Yeah. It's stunning, the lack of self-awareness of someone like Sarah Huckleberry Sanders.
How dare you?
Call her. She, look, here's the thing. They all quote King, and I don't know at this point whether it's ignorance or trolling. I think for some it's ignorance, because let's be honest, none of these people on the right have ever read MLK's writings. They haven't even listened to speeches beyond the one line from the one speech that you referenced. But there are others who I think know it full well, and they're just trolling now. They know full well what King actually thought about this. Martin Luther King talked about this thing that we call affirmative action. He even referred to it as preferential treatment, and he defended it. In 1963, in his book, Why We Can't Wait, and it was not the first time he did it, and it wouldn't be the last. But in 1963, in that book, I think he wrote it in 63. It was released in 64. But he's writing it at the same time that the March on Washington took place. He makes a point, and he specifically jabs those people in the liberal coalition who didn't support sort of targeted efforts for black folks. And he says that some of our friends recoil in horror, and he's making fun of them whenever this suggestion of preferential or compensatory treatment is raised. They seem to think that it's enough, basically, he goes on to say, to just sort of tell everybody to run the race. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I've written this, and it's in several of my columns, and it's in my book. He says that whenever this issue of preferential or compensatory treatment is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro, they insist, should be granted equality, but should ask for nothing more, because it's but then King goes on to say it's obvious that if a man enters a race 300 years after another man, he would have to perform some incredible feat in order to catch up. So I did remember the quote. So essentially what he's saying is, y'all keep talking about this like it's a fair race, but you're ignoring all of history. Now, that doesn't mean King was right. If you want to disagree with MLK, who said that same thing in 65, said it again in 67, said it again in 68 before his death in various speeches, interviews, and writings, so be it. You don't have to agree with Dr. King, but it is fundamentally dishonest to quote Dr. King as the person for whom you are an apostle or a disciple. You are not. If you are opposed to these efforts, you are not in the tradition of MLK or anyone from that movement. So just own that. It's okay. Like, admit that you're on the other side of this than Dr. King, because that's the reality. It's simply, and here's the other point about that quote. putting aside the historical disingenuousness of it, what in the world does SAT have to do with the content of one's character? What does GPA have to do with the I've known a lot of people who had really high SAT scores whose character is for shit.
I would say some of the biggest assholes in the world.
Of course. Look, I don't have any doubt that Joseph Goebbels would have done well on the SAT.
Right.
Ted Bundy did very well on it. Ted Kaczynski was a fucking genius. I don't think that really tells us anything about the content of their character. I'm sure that all the rich white boys, and they were rich and they were overwhelmingly white, who tanked the stock market in 2008 and 2009. I'm sure they all did well on not just the SAT, but the MCAT when they took that to go to business school. I'm sure they all have tested well since they were in kindergarten. What does it have to do with character? Look, I would be more than happy to meet those conservatives who like to quote King. I'll meet them halfway. Okay, fine. You want to get rid of racial preferences, what you call racial preferences, and not look at race? Okay, let's look at character. But then we got to get rid of these bogus qualification standards too, and make it an actual character assessment. Because if you look up the definition of character, you know what one of the indicators of character is? Perseverance, the ability to overcome obstacles. You know who has that? People who have been shit on by racial discrimination their entire history on this land. So I would suggest if we actually were going to judge based on character, you'd have a lot of poor folk getting in. You'd have a lot of black folk getting in. You'd have a lot of queer folk getting in. You'd have a lot of women who've overcome sexism getting in, and white boys have to fend for themselves. How about that? I don't think these folks mean that, though. I think they equate academic excellence with character when there is no necessary correlation between any of those things. So they're being disingenuous on two levels, historically and definitionally, when they talk about that concept.
And just getting back to the actual justices and the character that they may or may not have, Clarence Thomas, Kavanaugh, Alito. I mean, what about their character, and certainly what we've learned about the things that they've been involved with in terms of corruption lately, and what we've always known about Clarence Thomas? I believe Anita Hill.
Of course, we have a gaggle of completely unethical people on the court, all of them on the right, from what I can tell, unless there's some evidence about the others that I don't know. And we have, in this case, at least a few of them, appointed by an individual whose character is clearly less than stellar. That was the funniest part of the reaction to this decision, is Donald Trump saying, finally, we'll be getting back to merit the way it ought to be. Yeah, when he got into Penn and probably didn't even take his own SAT.
He's a legitimate person, though. Did you hear that? Did you hear that quote?
That? What?
Did you hear Trump said that this week?
What'd he say?
He said he was just complaining about the Jack Smith indictments, and he's like, he goes, it was about what he said on tape on the classified documents. He said, this is really what he said, and almost exactly a quote. He goes, I don't say wrong things. I say right things. I am a legitimate person. It was very Fredo-esque. It was just so bizarre. He said, I am a Tim, since you didn't hear it, you're hearing it for the first time. A person, a human, declared, I am legitimate. I am legit. I don't even understand that quote, except for the part where I completely understand where it comes from. He's begging, as he always been, to be included at the big boy table. And he was the fucking president of the United States. And he still is so insecure, as he should be, because he is not a legitimate person.
Right. And of course, he didn't get into Penn on his merits. We know it was because the admissions officer liked his brother, and had some feelings for the family. I'm sure that Don Jr. didn't kick ass on the SAT.
Well,
I don't know about Ivanka. I'm fairly confident Eric didn't light the academic world on fire. Right. So this idea that we're going to get back to merit, this is the great myth. And this has always been the problem with the right wing critique of affirmative action, because the only way that you can genuinely oppose affirmative action is if you really believe that in its absence, we would have a merit-based system where everyone could rise or fall on the basis of their talent. And if you believe that, you're not paying attention to the way higher ed works, and you're not paying attention to the way America has worked.
Well, you're not paying attention to the way lower ed works. You already mentioned this, but I know for a fact, because I worked, you mentioned the Dalton School, probably the one that's even more prestigious in Manhattan. I worked at. I was there as a lacrosse coach when Eric and Don Jr. were students at the Trinity School, meaning they were set up. So was Donald by his dad, Fred. They were set up to succeed. They have all the tutors. They have all the extra things. My daughter had a tutor this year, which is what helped her in the one class she was struggling in. But we were able to afford that, and it wasn't cheap. But it's definitely because why her grade improved. I mean, there's so much evidence about what your experience in lower ed means to your acceptance in higher ed.
Right. And the difference is for the right, they don't mind the systematized role that race plays when it benefits the existing power structure. Right. What they don't like is the conscious consideration of race when it might equalize resources. So either way, race is in the picture, right? It's not like you get rid of affirmative action and now race will play no role in who gets in. No, race will still play a role in who gets in, and not just because of the alumni preferences that everybody likes to talk about, or the lacrosse or the crew preferences that people, but just because of the inequities in K-12, which replicate the neighborhood inequities, the familial inequities, the wealth inheritance disparities. All of those things will get recreated, but because it is systemic, the court has long said, this isn't even a new thing. They've been saying this for a quarter century or more, that they cannot remedy what they call societal discrimination, or what I might call systemic racism or institutional racism, because you have to have a specific action at a specific time with a specific victim who can identify how it happened, when it happened, and to whom it happened. And so, in other words, if I explicitly consider race and I use race as a way to deny somebody something or to approve somebody for something, they can strike that down. But if the whole background noise of the society is doing that as a matter of just daily routine because of the patterns that are set in place and Newton's first law of motion, which says an object in motion tends to remain in motion, right? Then the court is basically saying, well, we can't really do anything about it.
And lastly, I think I read that this was mentioned somehow, or people picked up on it. Obviously, a lot of people talking about, well, legacy admissions still matter. We've covered that. But the military apparently is still going to have affirmative action. Is that right, in recruitment and acceptance into the military?
I think so. I haven't looked at the subtext within the decisions, whether or not an exception was carved out for that. I know the military academy certainly wanted to, and the military itself wants to. It's interesting, though, right? Because if you're going to make the argument that, and maybe the court said this, I don't know, and I'm not sure, but if in fact the court has given some type of a codicil that would allow the military academies or the military itself to continue to consider race, what does that say? It says that, well, we think diversity is important for that group that might get killed. You know,
the headline of the Wall Street Journal: military academies exempt from Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling. Military Times: service academies exempt from Supreme Court affirmative action.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating, because what that is an acknowledgement that diversity and inclusion is of value in creating cohesive units. And there are people who disagree with that, by the way. There are people who would say, no, we don't want that. That's wokeness in the military. But for the most part, the military itself says that, right? They say this is valuable. So why is it valuable in a platoon? Why is it valuable in a dorm at a military academy? Why is it valuable there, but it's not valuable in an academic space? If it has value, if diversity is valuable, why is it only, so it's, in other words, black people are good enough to serve the country and maybe get shot at and killed, but they're not good enough to do chemistry at Yale. They're not good enough to do engineering or be an ed major or anthropology or whatever the hell that they might want to study, computer science or anything else at Penn or at Columbia. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of carve out, isn't it? And I think it, again, speaks to the utter hypocrisy of the court on this issue. This isn't a principled decision. It is when you start carving out things, even when Roberts says that schools can consider race as long as it's in the context of individualized experience, that's what it already was. Right. In almost every instance, right? It was somebody saying, yeah, I didn't get the best SAT, but we didn't have any AP courses in my school. Right. And this is the shit I was dealing with. So in effect, you could argue the court didn't change anything, but I'm afraid that schools will think now that they can't do anything, that they can't consider it at all. And I'm afraid that's why the numbers will drop. If the schools are smart, they'll realize the shit that they're allowed to do still is what they were already doing. Right. They just need to do it better and with more resources.
Tim Wise, always awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This was great as always, and I hope to talk soon again, pal.
Sounds good, buddy.
All right, Tim Wise, everybody. I had to end that somewhat abruptly because I had a hard out, but I love those conversations with him. Always a treasure and a pleasure. Go get all of his books, follow him on Twitter, learn more in the show notes about Tim and all of my guests. And no, of course, I can't do it without you. Thank you so much for listening, for telling people about it, for promoting the show. Go follow me on the TikTok. I've got almost 500 followers there. Look at me go. Pete.Dominic. That's the account. Of course, YouTube.com/standupwithpete. Posted more clips there, and Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I am trying to post on all of them, folks. Now they got new ones, too. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Post. I'm on Mastodon, though I never use those, but I'll figure them out because that's just part of the game. You're talking into a microphone, you want people to hear it, you got to tell them it's on. So quit complaining about promotion, folks, right? Okay, well, in lieu of the quote of the day, I've decided to include a little over 2-minute clip from Stephen Fry about self-pity. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Here he is now, the British actor, comedian, writer, performer, philosopher, Stephen Fry. Take it away.
Certainly the most destructive vice, if you like, that a person can have, more than pride, which is supposedly the number one of the cardinal sins, is self-pity. I think self-pity is the worst possible emotion anyone can have, and the most destructive. It is, to slightly paraphrase what Wilde said about hatred, and I think actually hatred's a subset of self-pity, not the other way around. It destroys everything around it except itself. Self-pity will destroy relationships, it'll destroy anything that's good, it will fulfill all the prophecies it makes and leave only itself. And it's so simple to imagine that one is hard done by and that things are unfair and that one is underappreciated and that if only one had had a chance at this, when only one had had a chance at that, things would have gone better, you would be happier if only this, that one is unlucky, all those things. And some of them may well even be true. But to pity oneself as a result of them is to do oneself an enormous disservice. I think it's one of the things we find unattractive about the American culture, a culture which I find mostly extremely attractive, and I like Americans, and I love being in America. But just occasionally there'll be some example of the absolutely ravening self-pity that they are capable of, and you see it in their talk shows, and it's an appalling spectacle, and it's so self-destructive. I almost wanted once to publish a self-help book saying how to be happy by Stephen Fry, guaranteed success, and the people buy this huge book, and it's all blank pages, and the first page would just say, "Stop feeling sorry for yourself, and you will be happy." Use the rest of the book to write down your interesting thoughts and drawings, and that's what the book would be, and it would be true. And it sounds like, oh, that's so simple, because it's not simple to stop feeling sorry for yourself. It's bloody hard, because we do feel sorry for ourselves. It's what Genesis is all about.
Oh, I think he's covered it all there. I don't have much to add more than the specifics from my own life, and I just thought that was something. Well, when I watched it, it was liberating and somewhat shaming for me. But I think there's a lot of guys out there like me that didn't quite experience, didn't realize or recognize that when we're feeling bad for ourselves because we're underappreciated or we're not where we think we deserve to be or something, we spend time there wallowing and feeling bad for ourselves, and that is not time well spent. That's what I've learned. Better late than never. I'll talk more about it with experts here on the show, and if you're someone who relates to that, a couple of you have reached out to me. I'd love to hear from you, and we can talk more about it. All right, I will talk to you tomorrow, or maybe later today. I may be dropping something. We'll see. You never know with this program and the agility with which I have to book, interview, and post for you to listen to these great conversations. At least that's what I think. John Carroll, take us away.
We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering see him flee the scene of that experiment. If you stand up, all right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.